In the name of God, the beneficent, the merciful, the creator and the sustainer of the universe, peace and blessings upon his servant and messenger Muhammad forever. Ameen. I greet you in our usual fashion, Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be unto you. Today we have our 39th program in our series dealing with the social system of Islam. We'll be continuing our discussion of the topic of marital relations in Islam, continuing our discussion of the rights of the wife, and then going on to some discussion of the rights of the husband. I have joining me on the program as usual Dr. Jamal Badawi of St. Mary's University. Brother Jamal, Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Could I ask you to quickly highlight the main points that we touched on in last week's program?
Okay, like you indicated, Brother Hamid, this continues on the discussion of marital relationship. Actually, it's the third in the subject dealing with the rights of the wife. Yesterday, or I should say last program, we talked about the obligation mainly of the husband to gratify the instinctive need of his wife in terms of matrimonial relationships, and what the Islamic law provides by way of enforcement to make sure that she's not deprived of her natural rights. And then we talked about some related or allied subjects. One dealt with the so-called birth control, and we indicated that in special individual cases where there is a good reason for that, there is no evidence that it is unlawful. In other words, it may be permissible. Likewise, we discussed briefly about abortion. We indicated that it is the basic rule that it is unlawful except for saving the life of the mother, or, as some jurists, but not all, add the case of certainty about the deformity of the fetus in early stages. And we said that this unlawfulness becomes even much greater if the fetus is 4 months old or beyond. The final question that was raised dealt with the so-called test tube baby, even though I don't believe that any baby really is produced in a test tube. I think it's a misnomer, but I mean using the test tube for as an aiding factor in fertilization. And again, we indicated that there are different cases. There might be the case of blockage in the fallopian tube, where the egg comes from the mother and the sperm come from the father, but they are simply artificially fertilized in a test tube and then re-implanted in the mother's uterus, in which case we said that the tendency among jurists is that this is permissible. It's just an aiding or like treatment of infertility. The other case is the artificial insemination involving a sperm of another person other than the husband, and we said that the tendency among jurists here is that this is unlawful because it's some kind of what I call like adultery by proxy, and it leads also to confusion about the true lineage of the child. The final question dealt with the surrogate motherhood, where the egg comes from the real mother, the sperm comes from the father, but instead of implanting the fertilized egg in the mother's womb, it is implanted in another hired woman to act as a surrogate mother. And then we indicated the reasons why many jurists consider that to be inconsistent with Islamic law, even though some ended by saying maybe in some extreme circumstances it may not be regarded as totally out of question.
Well, I'd like to begin today's program by asking you perhaps to expand a bit on that. Can we infer from that there may be some situations where surrogate motherhood would be considered appropriate and justifiable, permissible?
Well, this has to be put really in a very delicate way, and perhaps I could quote you the jurist who addressed that particular issue, because it's a contemporary issue. We have not heard from many other jurists whether they agree or disagree with him. That's Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi in his book Fatawa Mu'asira, which means contemporary verdicts. After he mentioned the various reservations that we discussed last time about spoiling the nature of motherhood and leading to confusion, he ended by saying that this is marfudun shar'an mamnu'un fiqhan. He said it's rejected as an approach from the point of view of Islamic law, and actually it should be forbidden. However, on page 498 of the same book, he said that if the scientists or people working in that field disregard these basic rules pertaining to ethics and pertaining to the natural creation of God and how they try to go around this, sometimes unjustifiably, he said if this happened to be a widespread means, then in order to reduce its evil, there must be some controls. So his reference to controls may give the impression that it's something which is highly desirable, highly rejected, if you will. But should it happen, according to the basic rules in Islamic jurisprudence, one should try his best to reduce the evil of that technique. And he said, for example, that one of those controls is that the surrogate mother must be a married woman to start with, because otherwise it might raise a question about the chastity of the mother, the surrogate mother. I mean, if a surrogate mother is unmarried girl and then she gets pregnant as a result of this implantation, I mean, there's some question that might be raised about her reputation. Secondly, that not only should this woman or mother be married, she should also have the permission of her husband to act as a surrogate mother, because this will affect his rights as a husband, and we'll see in some ways it greatly affects his interest. A third is that she cannot have this or have this implantation unless a certain waiting period, roughly 3 months, has elapsed between the last time that her husband had any intimate relationship with her, or else the fetus would not be for certain known to be whether it belongs to her real husband or to the other woman who hired her for the job. Fourthly, he said that in Islamic law, the father of the fetus or the child, whichever the case, is totally responsible for the maintenance both of the child when he's born and for the child and mother, or the fetus and the mother, which means that the full responsibility of maintenance would fall on the shoulder not of the husband of that hired woman, but on the real father of the fetus in her womb. Fifthly, that all the rules pertaining to suckling and prohibition in marriage as a result of suckling would apply, because the surrogate mother would be regarded, in fact, in a position of a mother, and, for example, the child cannot marry her or her children, for that matter. But he concludes, however, and this is something I think we have to be very careful about, that he said the best thing is not to get into that, and these measures are just mentioned as controls. If it is an evil already that is present, how could you possibly reduce the extent of that evil? But it, again, seemed to be quite inconsistent with the spirit of Islamic law.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, in the vein of these contemporary issues, there's another area that I'd like to touch upon, and that's this whole question of determination of the sex of the offspring. It's been suggested that the time may not be too far distant when parents eventually may be able to choose the sex of their child. I'd be interested in getting your opinion of the Islamic viewpoint of this from the Islamic law point of view.
Okay, to start with, as a non-specialist, I must say that to the best of my knowledge, this has not succeeded yet in humans. But there is literature about the various experiments made on animals. But so far, I haven't heard of this being done in human embryology. It's a matter really that relates to genetics, genetic engineering, as some people also might call. And as you know, the sex of the fetus is determined largely by the sperm. And this is just a matter of finding what kind of genes are there, you know, the various X and Y combinations that genetic people or geneticists speak about. So the theory behind it was that if the nature of the genes, male or female, can be determined early, it may be possible to, let's say, obtain the sperm from the father and choose in the lab the one or the sperm with the male genes, and again fertilize the egg artificially or in the test tube, and then implant that in the womb of the mother, and as such hoping, as scientists may be, to be able to choose the sex of the child. Now, some of the questions that some people may raise about this, especially from Muslim point of view, they may say that the Quran, after all, indicates that, as one verse says, Allah creates whatever He pleases. He gives to some males, He gives to some parents only females, or give both male and female to the same parents, or even make whoever He wishes infertile or barren. However, a process like this need not necessarily be regarded as constituting creation. You're not really competing with God in creation because you're not creating anything. Like the Quran says, humans will not be able to create even a fly, even if they put all their efforts into it, because creation means to have something from nothing. But in the case of artificial fertilization like this, you're really talking about something that God has already created. So it may not necessarily contradict from it. I'm just looking at it from that standpoint.
Yes.
And the Quran also indicates, وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ, that you cannot will or desire or want really or succeed to achieve anything unless it is by leave or permission from God. That's one point. A second point which relates also not to this issue but to the issue of trying to find out the sex of the embryo already in the womb of the mother through certain tests. And some might say that this is erroneous because it contradicts the verse in the Quran, Allahu ya'lamu ma tahmilu kullu untha, that God knows what any or what every female bears in her womb. But again, this might be stretching the meaning of the verse too much, because the knowledge, for example, as to whether the fetus in the womb of the mother is male or female, does not necessarily mean that we've got all the knowledge about him. So the verse could be referring actually to the knowledge of God, not only about the sex of the fetus, but about the character of the person, what his life would be, when he or she is going to die, what destiny that person may be facing. So this may not necessarily be regarded as interference or encroachment on the domain of God. The same scholar I was referring to, the same jurist, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, has mentioned that also in the same book I quoted earlier. And he said, it is not really regarded as such. However, it is better, it is much preferable not to try to do this and to leave this to the will of God, rather than trying to, as if you're just shopping for a particular child. There are very serious consequences, of course, if this becomes readily available. Lots of abuses could be in store.
Right. Well, now we've covered a number of issues dealing with the rights of the wife. I'd like to shift the discussion now to discussion of some of the rights of the husband. Could you give us some idea about the rights of the husband?
Okay, we're balancing the picture now. All right. If it's husband's turn, I think perhaps one of the most concise sayings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to reflect the husband's right, which is wife's obligation, is a saying that was narrated in An-Nasa'i and Ibn Majah, in which he basically says that the best of women, that's the most blessed of wives, is the wife who, if you look at her, she pleases you. If you ask her to do something, she obeys you, and if you're away or absent, she safeguards her chastity and your possessions or property. Yeah. Let me just take the first one. إذا نظر إليها سرته. When he looks at her, she pleases him. In fact, this portion of the prophetic saying is simply an echoing of one beautiful verse in the Quran describing believers. And it says, وَالَّذِينَ يَقُولُونَ رَبَّنَا هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا وَذُرِّيَّاتِنَا قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ وَاجْعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا. That those who pray, O Lord, grant unto us wives and offsprings who will be the apple of our eyes, or the coolness of our eyes, and make us models for the righteous. In other words, as we have seen in previous programs dealing with the rights of the wife, we indicated that it is an obligation on the Muslim husband, according to Islamic law, not to hurt his wife, to respect her, and to treat her in love and consideration. The picture should be balanced. Mm-hmm. She also should be required and expected to respect her husband, not to hurt him, and to treat him in love and consideration. We have seen that a Muslim husband, and we have proved that in so many, or from so many angles in previous programs, is asked to do his best to look after the well-being and the comfort of his wife. It is only fair to expect that the wife also would do her best to look after his well-being and his comfort. But in addition to this broader concept, which is not just a reflection of nazara ilayha, or looked at her in just physical sense, it goes beyond that. But in addition to that also, it does not rule out another meaning of looking at her, that is to be cheerful, that the wife should be cheerful to her husband, and as such achieve the purpose of marriage, which the Quran mentioned, and we quoted the verses before, to provide soothing comfort and tranquility for the husband. Which means that the husband would not come home to find a grouchy, grim, frowning wife bombarding him with all kinds of problems before he even say, peace be upon you, or have some rest or something to eat. It does not also preclude something more specific, that the wife, Muslim wife, is urged and encouraged to beautify herself for her husband, to look her best for her husband. Not that every time he comes home, she not combing her hair, wearing his apron and smelling onion from cooking, and say, hey, honey, you know. This, in other words, she has some obligation also to satisfy him and to look her best. Now, we're not saying, of course, that she should always look like a beauty queen or something of that sort. Nor are we saying that she should violate the various Islamic etiquette pertaining to the limits of adornment and with whom, and whether that should be limited to the home or outside. This we have covered already in a series on moral teaching of Islam. But what I'm simply saying is that sometimes in our civilization the things are put upside down.
Yes.
In many cases, the wife would look her best when she's going out in the company of other people other than her husband, which is again against Islam. It should not be this way. Whereas in the home with her husband, she looks her worst. This is, in the Islamic perspective, this is just like putting things upside down. She should look good in both ways, but at least adornment and beautification and looking really appealing is something that should be reserved really to the home, not for the eyes of other onlookers. In fact, just to make the picture balanced again, it is not only an obligation on the wife, because Islam does not regard the wife simply as an object of pleasure, but as Ibn Abbas, one of the great companions of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, put it very nicely. He said, إِنِّي لَأَتَزَيَّنُ لِمْرَأَتِي كَمَا تَتَزَيَّنُ لِي. I try to look handsome and to look my best to my wife as she looks to me, or as she is expected to look also her best to me. And then he cited a verse in the Quran in chapter 2, verse 187, وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. That is for women or for wives. There are rights similar to the rights of their husbands over them. So in other words, expectation should be also mutual. But this all relate to the topic or the issue of the first portion of the saying, if he looks at her, she pleases him.
Mm-hmm. Well, now you mentioned that a wife should obey her husband. I'd like to ask you if you could give some explanation of the basis of this right.
I think this is perhaps a very interesting and significant area to explore, because many times when you mention the word obedience, everybody has his own conception as to what obedience really entails. Mm-hmm. For some, obedience is total subordination, subjection. For some, obedience means unquestioned acceptance of authority, absolute authority. For some, they might look at obedience as lack of stubbornness and cooperative attitude. So I think it's quite important to make sure what is really meant. But to address your question first, what are the basis for that obedience? What is the authentic reference to that? Maybe I can give a reference to a key verse in the Quran that deal with that subject. That appears in chapter 3, verse 34. Describing the pious women, that's from the Islamic standpoint. It says, فَالصَّالِحَاتُ قَانِتَاتٌ حَافِظَاتٌ لِلْغَيْبِ بِمَا حَفِظَ اللَّهِ. That the pious women, the righteous women, are obedient. And this is interpreted to mean obedient both to God and to their husbands. Yes. And what shows that actually it refers also to husband, the remaining part says, حَافِظَةٌ لِلْغَيْبِ, which means that they are, in the absence of their husbands, they are safeguarding, or they safeguard what God wanted them to safeguard. That is what was mentioned previously, to preserve or to safeguard their chastity and the property of their husband, to regard that as a trust. In fact, the portion immediately, even before that, it says, الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم. It says, men, meaning husbands, are قوامون, which is translated usually maintainers and protectors of women, meaning wives, because God made some of them excel over the others. That's the closest translation I can give, because God made some of them excel over the others, and because they, that is men, spend or expend of their sustenance, that is their financial responsibility for the family. Now, the word قوامون, which appears in this verse, is quite significant, and sometimes there are difficulties in translation. قوام in Arabic means قام على الشيء, somebody who stood up for something, which could carry a number of shades of meaning. That the husbands are responsible for the maintenance of their families, their wives. It could mean that they are protectors of their wives. They are in charge, or they are ones who look after protection and security, both security in the physical sense as well as psychological security. That is also part of the meaning. It's not only just physical. It could also mean being responsible for the leadership of the family. These are all shades of meaning which falls within the word قوامون. This means then that according to that verse, which is regarded by Muslims as a divine command, a divine directive, the husband has the ultimate responsibility to be the head or to be the leader of the particular family unit. But of course, we're talking here about obedience and leadership in the Islamic sense.
Well, it appears from what you said that some English translations of this verse give perhaps an incorrect meaning. Mm-hmm. Some suggest that a meaning which would have one believe that men are superior to women. Could you perhaps...
Yeah, actually some translate it this way, that men are superior. Now, I think this is an erroneous translation. I'll give you the evidence for this. First of all, it should be made clear that there is no single Quranic text which categorically says that men are superior to women. That's non-existent. There is nothing like that in the Quran. None even in any prophetic tradition that I'm familiar with. And if this is the case, if you retranslate the English translation back to Arabic, it would give you a totally different thing from what you find in the Quran. If it is true that the Quran infers from this or means that men are superior to women, and you translate that to Arabic, it would read الرجال أفضل من النساء, and there is no such verse in the Quran. The text does not say that. Secondly, the verse even did not say that God made men categorically excel women, period, in every respect. Because again, if you retranslate that to Arabic, it reads بما فضل الله النساء على الرجال على النساء. There is no such verse in the Quran. So both of these translations are obviously erroneous, because once you put it back into Arabic, it gives you something totally different from what you find in the verse. Not only this, there is something quite interesting even in the grammatical structure of that verse. It says men are in charge, or men are maintainers and responsible for their wives. And then it says because God made some of them excel over the others. And there is a question here. Who are them and who are those others? And excelling in what sense? Let me give you a number or two at least interpretations for this. Mm-hmm. One interpretation, which I do not necessarily agree with, but we'll mention it though, is that it says that the pronoun used in that verse, them, بعضهم in Arabic, is really a masculine pronoun. It's used for masculine. However, they say as a grammatical rule in the Arabic language, you can use also the masculine pronoun to refer to both men and women, not necessarily all to males. All right? And according to a rule in the Arabic grammar called at-taghlib, it still can be used to refer to both, which means that not that men are made preferred categorically to women. It does not necessarily mean that, but it could mean that God made some of them, whether they are men or women, excel in some aspects or respects or the other over others, which could be men or women, which does not necessarily specify a particular sex. However, this explanation is valid grammatically speaking, and maybe the verse might be giving a hint at that. But the second opinion, which I feel to be more reasonable, is that the context of this verse deals with marital relationships. In fact, the immediate portion after this part, it says because men spend of their sustenance. So it seems to refer that the overall excelling or excellence or the extra that God has given to men actually refers to one particular aspect pertaining to the leadership of the family and shouldering the burden of the financial, emotional, and other needs of the family as being heads of the household. But even then, this has no connotation whatsoever with overall superiority.
Well, we'll stop at that point today and perhaps come back and develop this point a little bit further next week. We want to thank you for watching our program. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.